Hi everyone, let's talk about editing exercise number 1. Now, an important thing to know about the editing exercises is that there will often be several right answers to the exercises in the book. Most of the exercises ask you to identify some things, which usually lends itself well to specific right or wrong answers, but they also ask you to revise some things. And there are often several possibilities for revising the sentences to make them better. So when I grade your responses, I'll use this rubric, which gives lots of leeway for different possible answers. First, you get points for actually doing the whole thing. If you miss parts of it, you get points off. Then you get points for demonstrating that you understand the material in the chapter. If it looks like you understood what you read, you'll get points. Then you get points if the revision you make to the material improves the material in some way. All right. Let's get down to business. We'll start by defining the terms you need to know for this lesson. Verb. The glossary of style defines a verb as the word that must agree with the subject in number and that can be inflected for past or present. The examples they give are the book is ready, with is being the verb, and the books were returned, with were being the verb. Now, this is different than the typical grade school definition of verb as action verb, and that's actually a big point of the chapter, but we'll get to that later. Some verbs describe actions, but some, like is and were, don't. Next definition, subject. Style defines subject as the subject is what the verb agrees with in number, and they give the examples. 2 men are at the door, with 2 men being the subject, which agrees with are the verb. And the other example is 1 man is at the door, with 1 man being the subject and is being the verb. Yet again, this differs from the typical grade school definition of subject, which is usually something like the thing the sentence is about. And again, you'll see why in just a minute. Okay, last definition before we move on. Whole subject. Here's what style has to say about the whole subject. You can identify a whole subject once you identify its verb. Put a who or what in front of the verb and turn the sentence into a question. The fullest answer to the question is the whole subject. Easy, right? They give you some examples. The ability of the city to manage education is an accepted fact. So the verb is here, and then you ask the question, what is an accepted fact? The answer, which is the whole subject, is the ability of the subject to manage education. Well, the ability of the city to manage education. Okay, cool. So that's what you need to know before you get to the meat of the lesson. Now, why does the book give you those kind of complicated and maybe not super helpful definitions for subject, verb, and whole subject? That's because those grade school definitions of verbs and subjects don't always hold true, and that's often what makes sentences dense and confusing. Let's take an example from the book. So they start with a story. Once upon a time, as a walk through the woods was taking place on the part of Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf's jump out from behind a tree occurred, causing her fright. Holy wordy fairy tale, Batman, what the heck? There are two sentences in that one sentence there, so let's start with the first mini sentence or clause. As a walk through the woods was taking place on the part of Little Red Riding Hood. The grammatical subject is a walk through the woods, and the verb is was taking place. Now the second mini sentence, the wolf's jump out from behind a tree, is the subject, and occurred is the verb. But I think we can all agree that that version of the story is super convoluted and frankly unnecessary. Why? Well, because the grammatical subjects in the story are not the things that the story is about, and the main verbs are not action words. The book gives you a few principles to help you make the story easier to read. The first being, make main characters subjects. So what's the character in that first mini sentence? As a walk through the woods was taking place on the part of Little Red Riding Hood. Well, it's Little Red Riding Hood, of course, so let's make that the subject. Now the second principle they give you is make important actions verbs. So what's the verb in that part of the sentence? as a walk in the woods was taking place on the part of Little Red Riding Hood. It's walk. So let's make that the verb. Now what do we have? As Little Red Riding Hood was walking through the woods. Much better. Now let's do the same thing to the second part of the sentence. The wolf's jump out from behind a tree occurred, causing her fright. What's the subject here? It's the wolf. What's he doing? Jumping out from behind a tree and causing Little Red Riding Hood fright. Or, well, we could shorten that down and say, scaring her. So now we have the wolf jumped out from behind a tree and scared her. Again, much better. As Little Red Riding Hood was walking through the woods, the wolf jumped out from behind a tree and scared her. Much better than the original. And you'll notice that the version that I just came up with is slightly different than the one in the book because, as I said, there are several ways to revise these things. One common problem with putting actions into verbs is that sometimes people feel like it's just not fancy or serious enough, and so they turn those verbs into nouns. Sometimes they turn adjectives into nouns too. That's called nominalization, which is itself a nominalization, funnily enough. Let's take a few examples from the original Red Riding Hood story. Can you find some nominalizations in the story? I found one. In this story, the word jump is a noun, not a verb. That one's kind of tricky though because it looks exactly like the verb jump. Lots of nominalizations will have endings that you can easily recognize. ION, ANCE or ENCE, Y, NESS, or even ING, which turns the verb into a gerund. So let's talk about the exercise for a minute. In the first part, you're trying to identify the subjects, verbs, actions, and characters. The whole point is that the sentences where the characters are the subjects and the actions are the verbs should be much clearer. And when the characters aren't the subjects or the actions aren't the verbs, the sentences are much denser and harder to read. So then in the second part, you take those dense sentences and make them clearer by turning the characters into subjects and the actions into verbs. Then in part 3, you're given some nominalizations to turn into verbs and asked to revise the sentences. I'm not going to go through the whole editing exercise because I want you to be able to try it again if you didn't do well the first time around. I'll talk more about that in a second, but I will go over one. Let's do 3B. Attempts by economists at defining full employment have been met with failure. So what are the characters? Looks like economists are the characters in this sentence, but the grammatical subject is attempts. The actions are attempts and failing, but the verb is have been met. Attempts have been met. So let's revise it. We could say economists have attempted to define full employment but have failed. We could also say economists' attempts to define full employment have failed, which keeps attempts as a subject, but it's still a little bit clearer than the original. All right, so hopefully by now the strategies here are a bit clearer. If you didn't do so well on the exercise and would like to try again, email me and let me know. With one caveat, anyone who received anything below a 90 on the exercise can revise again, if you'd like to. You don't have to, but you can give it a shot. If you got a 90 or above, you understood the exercise pretty well, and the goal of revising is to help people who didn't understand it as well to try and understand it better. All right, that's it for now. See you again soon.